Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Maple Madness. I came across a video of Mark Carney lying to Canadians about Bill C-2. Here is a video.
I want to highlight a very important bill that needs to move, which is Bill C-2, which is another series of border measures. But one of the core things that it includes is something called lawful access. Now, lawful access is through the courts, getting a warrant, but being able to access messaging between suspected criminals.
Okay, so we heard him say lawful access. Now, let's break down the truth of Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act, introduced on June 3rd, 2025 by Prime Minister Mark Carney's Liberal government. It has been presented as a measure to enhance border security, combat smuggling, organized crime, and fentanyl trafficking. This omnibus bill amends over 14 different laws, including the Criminal Code, Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, and Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. While some provisions address legitimate threats, many expand government and law enforcement powers in ways that lack sufficient oversight, erode privacy and due process, and shift authority away from democratic institutions like Parliament and the courts. This creates risk of overreach that could be exploited to target dissenters, activists, and political opponents under vague pretexts like national security or public safety. Let's examine the key anti-democratic elements factually, their negative impacts on Canadians, and potential for misuse, all based on the bill's text and expert analysis. I will be including the sources in the description of this video. First, the bill's omnibus structure itself is anti-democratic. By bundling diverse changes into one massive piece of legislation spanning surveillance, immigration, anti-money laundering, and more, it limits thorough parliamentary debate and scrutiny. And that really is a key here, because the Liberals have a habit over the last decade of pushing in way too many pieces of legislation into a single bill and then bundling it up and calling it a piece of legislation. But it is anti-democratic because no parliamentarian has the ability to go through it and fully and properly dissect it to debate the different pieces of it. Each piece should be its own bill. And that's it. It should no longer be allowed to have these ginormous pieces all pushed together. An example, aside from Bill C-2, would be the previous Bill C-63. That was a ginormous conglomerate of a bill that addressed way too many pieces to be properly dissected and debated in Parliament. I digress. Anyway, as the Green Party MP Elizabeth May noted during debates,
questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Seneca Grove Highlands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. An honourable colleague from Kitchener-Conestoga, my first opportunity to get in on this debate. And while people, obviously, Canadians are looking to the government for a policy that addresses borders, there are a lot of details in this bill because it's an omnibus bill and changes 14 different laws. I'm particularly concerned about the sections that will make it impossible for people who might have had refugee status to apply for it now if they've been in Canada sometime for other legitimate purposes. This bill will need amendments before I can vote for it. And I'm wondering, given that it's an omnibus bill, and honestly, my friend from Kitchener-Conestoga, he may not know, but is the government prepared to split this bill so that the relevant sections are studied by committees with expertise in immigration and refugee law? Others look at it from the Oceans Act perspective, etc.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
I thank my colleague for that question.
this approach makes it harder for lawmakers to address specific issues, potentially allowing problematic provisions to pass without adequate review. Now, typically, Elizabeth May is not a person I would be in agreement with. Her and I tend to have very different ideas. But in this particular case, she's right, and it does need to be addressed. It should not be allowed to continue on going this way. It is not a democratic process. For Canadians, this means reduced transparency in how laws are made, eroding trust in the democratic process, which I pretty much just explained. It could be exploited by governments to fast-track controversial measures with minimal opposition. And if we're being truthful here and honest, the Liberals really do aim to have minimal opposition. Hence the NDP Liberal coalition that went on for, well over a year and a half. Other major anti-democratic aspects is the expansion of lawful access to personal data without warrants, contrary to what Mark Carney just said. Part 14 of the bill allows police, CSIS, RCMP, and the CBSA to demand subscriber information such as names, addresses, IP addresses, email accounts, and billing details from telecom and online service providers based only on reasonable grounds to suspect. It would assist an investigation without judicial oversight. Again, key. How is that possibly a democratic piece of legislation? This lowers the threshold from previous requirements, potentially violating Charter Section 8, protections against unreasonable search and seizure, as flagged by the Department of Justice's own charter statement. For everyday Canadians, this means your online activity could be accessed more easily. Killing free expression under Charter Section 2B, for instance. If posts criticizing government policy are deemed suspicious, it could be exploited to surveil journalists, activists, or minority groups, fostering a climate of self-censorship and enabling political targeting without accountability. And I realize that if you are on Team Liberal, you're going to deny that, but the reality is there. It's in the wording of the bill. If these are not the potentials that are wanted, then the wording needs to change to make it so that's not an option. That's how legislation is supposed to work, and that is why we have parliamentary debate, to address these types of issues that are potential problems in the future within a piece of legislation, and then change the wording. This, somewhere along the lines over the last 10 years or so, has fallen to the wayside, and it's become very, I'm on team this or I'm on team that, and we're not debating and we're not working together to address pieces of legislation for the betterment of Canadians. And that's the entire point of Parliament. And if that part of Parliament isn't going to function properly on both sides, then Parliament is failed, and that is a far larger problem than what we think we are dealing with. Again, I digress. The bill promotes international data sharing under the second additional protocol to the Budapest Convention, allowing Canadian agencies to share personal data, including immigration and asylum details, with foreign governments more readily. Now, this piece alone is problematic because not all governments are equal around the world. And I realize that's a controversial statement in today's world, but they're not. And if you look at the CCP, for example, they target dissidents in other countries regularly. If we are going to be doing data sharing, and this information is going to be available to other countries, and we have a strategic partnership now with the CCP, that leaves open a doorway to be exploited and target CCP dissidents within Canadian borders. For example, or we'll say the IRGC, or even Russia. Whatever country you want to look at, not all governments treat their citizens the way you would expect them to be treated. And targeting dissidents is a thing in many different governments around the world. So within Canadian borders, we should be protecting these people, and we should be helping them to stay safe, not paving a pathway that will be exploited by bad apples to target them. But that's not what this bill does. This bill opens that door. Privacy experts, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation, warn this opens the floodgates to U.S. surveillance and could expose data to authoritarian regimes with inadequate safeguards. Negative impacts include risks to dissidents or refugees whose information might be misused abroad, harming vulnerable Canadians or their families. The exploitation potential is high Foreign allies could request data on critics, or the system could be used domestically to monitor cross-border activism, bypassing Canadian privacy laws. It really is a humongous problem, and it's not even really being addressed or looked at. And it blows my mind. It really does baffle my mind why this particular piece isn't being pointed out in mass media, because it's absolute chaos. You're paving the way to allow these people to be further hurt. They already broke free from their country to get here, and now we're going to allow their country to reach their hand into Canada? Like, what are we doing here? Another concerning provision is the $10,000 cash transaction limit. This bill amends the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act to prohibit businesses, professionals, and charities from accepting $10,000 or more in cash or related transactions totaling the amount for goods, services, or donations, with exemptions for banks and certain institutions. Penalties include fines up to 3 times the amount involved. While aimed at curbing illicit financing, this expands FinTrack's enforcement role without proportional oversight, requiring all regulated entities to register with the agency. For Canadians, it imposes compliance burdens on small businesses and charities, potentially reducing large cash donations common in some cultural or religious communities and limiting financial privacy in legitimate transactions. It could be exploited to scrutinize or penalize groups like community organizations or political fundraisers. If cash handling is flagged under broad money laundering suspicions, stifling grassroots activities. The bill also undermines due process in immigration and refugee systems. It grants ministers broad powers to suspend refugee protections during undefined, that's the key, they're undefined emergencies, impose strict time limits on asylum claims, enable mass cancellation of permits on public safety or national interest grounds, and restrict appeals, which we need a little bit of this and we need a little bit of that, to be completely honest. But this is part of the problem with having a bill that's so ginormous. It should be broken down into sections, into pieces. So we have an immigration issue in Canada. That's apparent. We have a lengthy court process for the immigrants. What would solve that? We need to shrink the court process. We need to do something to make that expedited. However that works out. Maybe we need to hire more judges. Whatever. I'm not an expert in this department. What I do know is this falls into that category of we have a problem, but piling it into one ginormous bill is not the answer. And we're not able to properly have the parliamentarians debate this. We have an immigration problem. We have entirely too many people flooding into this country, and a lot of them are not being properly vetted. That's all been exposed by CSIS, by the CBSA. But at the same time, restricting everything in a broad brush isn't the answer either, as Amnesty International calls this an attack on the right to seek asylum, potentially breaching Charter Section 7 rights to life, liberty, and security. Impacts on Canadians include harm to racialized and migrant communities, strained family reunification, and economic losses, such as to farmers relying on temporary foreign workers, as noted by the National Farmers Union. These powers could be exploited for political purposes, like targeting specific nationalities during elections or deporting critics without fair hearings. Again, this is part of the problem. Additionally, provisions in Part 15 introduce digital backdoors by potentially requiring tech companies to weaken encryption or provide law enforcement access to secure communications. Yes, you heard that correct. Weaken encryption in a country that pretty much regularly has hacking problems. Like the CRA has been hacked. If they can't keep the CRA safe with heightened encryptions, how bad will the exploitation of Canadian data become if we weaken encryptions and allow foreign bad apples to hack or even domestic bad apples to hack. This jeopardizes the cybersecurity for all users, as backdoors could be hacked by malicious actors. For Canadians, it means reduced online security, affecting everything from banking to personal messages, and could chill private discussions. So now not only are we looking at chilling free speech, free expression in Canada through bills like C-8 and C-9, now with Bill C-2, we're opening up the avenue to potentially chill personal conversations as well, because that information could be seeped out and used. Like, what's the game plan here? Are we just aimlessly going to continue walking into a complete surveillance state? The exploitation risks include government abuse to monitor opposition or leaks, or foreign hackers targeting weakened systems. Over 300 civil society groups, from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association to migrant rights organizations, have demanded the bill's withdrawal, labeling it a multi-pronged assault on human rights. Overall, Bill C-2 concentrates unchecked executive powers, bypassing judicial and parliamentary checks, which could foster the surveillance state and erode democratic norms. Negative impacts extend to all Canadians through diminished privacy, increased compliance costs, and weakened rights, while disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups. If exploited, it could suppress free speech, enable arbitrary enforcement, and align Canada with international surveillance regimes that prioritize control over liberties. This bill needs to be withdrawn. It needs to be broken up into many different pieces and then debated properly within Parliament. And the Liberals, because they are the ones in control right now, need to stop pushing these ginormous omnibus bills through Parliament, acting like it's just normal everyday policy. It's not. It's not okay to put all these different facets into one bill so nobody can debate it properly. That's not democratic. If this bill doesn't sit right with you and it makes you feel a little like this might be nefarious or this might be used against us down the road, contact your MP to demand the amendments, restoring oversight and protection. Support organizations like Amnesty International or the Canadian Council for Refugees through petitions. Use privacy tools like VPNs and encrypted apps for yourself. Stay informed. Democracy requires vigilance. Thanks for watching.